What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So, Paper Mario was a series that was always on the periphery for me, as someone who grew up with some of the Mario and Luigi RPGs. I'm not entirely sure why it took me so long to jump into these games. I remember having my eye on a hard copy of The Thousand Year Door, maybe back when I was in high school or something, but just never took the plunge. But with the recent Super Mario RPG remake and the upcoming Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door remake, this seemed like the perfect time to dive into this series that I previously was pretty unfamiliar with. Before I get into that though, my goal by the end of 2023 was to hit 1,000 subscribers, and because this video is going to be coming out, I believe on New Year's Eve or right around there, it seems unlikely that I will hit that threshold by the end of the year, but I do want to give a big thank you to those who have subscribed. As of recording this, I am just over 900 subs, and I'm going to keep pushing to hit 1,000 subscribers as quickly as I can, so that way we can kind of set a new goal for the end of 2024. I have been considering streaming the Mario and Luigi RPGs since there are some entries that I want to revisit and there are a few entries in that series that I've never played as well. So keep an eye out for that. And I'll hold my thoughts on the later Paper Mario games for the end of the video for those interested in that. The original Paper Mario, colloquially dubbed Paper Mario 64 these days just to distinguish which game you're talking about, takes place in a very Mario-centric setting, where you're primarily interacting with Toads, Goombas, Koopas, etc. This got me thinking about how Mario iconography, as far as the setting specifically, is pretty limited, partially because things can get pretty abstract and otherworldly in the Mario platformers, which, you know, is the majority of Mario's catalog, but also because the Mushroom Kingdom doesn't really have a set layout or distinct landmarks aside from Peach's castle and I guess Mario's house, if these various Mario RPGs are anything to go by. And by virtue of that, I'd say it's fair to credit Mario RPG and of course the Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi series for fleshing out the various worlds that they take place in. Although games like Superstar Saga take place in the Bean Bean Kingdom and, you know, it's not always in the Mushroom Kingdom specifically, but it was something that I was thinking about because you want to keep things varied in a 2D platform in particular as far as setting is concerned, and also because the Mushroom Kingdom doesn't have a set scope or scale as far as how big it is or how many different locales there are. It's not unbelievable when new settings are added as opposed to revisiting already established ones. But even so, Paper Mario's setting has the hub based in Toad Town, and you go to like Koopa Village, I think it's called, and just these various locales that the different species in the Mushroom Kingdom reside. And it also is able to capture the various locales of the different worlds from particularly Mario 3 and on. You kind of have the grassland, and then you have the desert, and there's like a snowy area, and there's a volcano area, but it's not to the point of feeling trite. It feels more like paying tribute to what was already established as far as Mario's locales and whatnot. And this kind of pivots me into talking story. Similar to what I was saying about this game's setting, the story is also very Mario-centric, although there is a slight twist on it where, yes, Bowser did kidnap Peach, but he also stole the Star Rod, which allows the user of it to grant wishes. The game actually opens with Mario trying to stop Bowser from taking Peach, but he's not able to do it because the Star Rod made Bowser too powerful. And so Mario needs to go throughout the world and gather the kidnapped Star Spirits in order to have the power to stop this more powerful Bowser. What struck me about this game's story in particular was its writing, where it managed to be lighthearted and fun while still keeping a semblance of danger when called for. And it's thanks in part to that simplicity of the story alongside the well-written dialogue that each chapter could focus more on being unique and memorable. Because there are some oddball locations in this game, but it's not quite as otherworldly feeling as you'll find in some of the other Mario RPGs out there. But I think it makes sense to keep things relatively tame for a first entry, especially for the Mario property and at the time this game released, which was pretty late into the N64 lifecycle. It's to me very impressive for an N64 game. And honestly, aside from the visuals, I feel like you could probably convince someone that this was a GameCube game, assuming you showed it to them with an HD texture pack installed, which is how I played this game. I ran it actually through Dolphin with the singular HD texture pack available for the Dolphin version specifically, since most people would probably opt to play this either obviously on actual hardware or through an N64 emulator, but I found in my minimal experience with N64 emulation that Dolphin just has a way more robust set of features that I like taking advantage of when possible. And thankfully I was able to do that while also playing with HD textures. Let's pivot into the combat a bit. I found in playing a lot of games this year with timed hits integrated into turn-based combat that there is a fine balance to be struck with it. And to explain what timed hits are for those who might not be familiar with that term, it's an addition to turn-based RPG combat in which you press a button right on time with the character's animation. In its most basic implementations, you just press the A button, and so right as an attack is about to land on the enemy, you press the A button and you deal extra damage, or you do an extra hit that results in dealing more damage. And the same goes for enemies attacking you, where if you time it just right, you can defend from their attacks. This can, in its best implementations, result in a more engaging turn-based system, but it can also result in a good amount of tedium if the actions are not varied enough, or if health pools are too large. In concept, you would think, yeah, adding timed hits to turn-based combat makes it so you have to pay attention and be engaged during the animations besides just watching them play out. And so at first blush, you would think, why don't we just integrate that into every RPG? The more I thought about it, at least, the more I think about how much I think that would bog down a lot of RPG experiences. Animations need to be at least slightly on the slower side in order to allow the player enough time to react. And so this does slow down turn-based combat, which tends to be pretty slow in most instances. And so the way that these first two Paper Mario games handle this and prevent combat from feeling too slow or tedious is that the health pools of the enemies and the damage dealt between you and the enemies stays really low throughout both of these games, which really does help prevent encounters from feeling tedious, as I did experience in the late game of Mario RPG and, funny enough, the early game primarily of Sea of Stars. And not to get into it too much, but the Mario and Luigi RPGs remedy this by varying the types of inputs you're doing and the timing of them and the different attacks you're dodging, as opposed to limiting health pools like it is in Paper Mario. And there is a good amount of variety in the inputs in Paper Mario, but not as diverse as the Mario and Luigi games. And so you're performing these various timed hits on enemies, some of which are vulnerable to certain types of attacks, like shelled enemies need to be jumped on to flip them over so you can attack their soft underbelly. Spiked enemies normally can't be jumped on, and so you need to use the hammer or figure out some other way to damage them or break through their defense. It's a relatively simple set of rules, but it's a simple set of rules that I feel is explored very thoroughly. And that simplicity also applies to your character stats, where every time Mario levels up, you can choose between your HP, FP, or BP. HP is health points, as you're probably familiar with. FP stands for flower points, which is how you perform more powerful actions. You can kind of think of it as MP or SP, as it's sometimes called in other RPGs. But then BP are badge points, which allow you to equip various badges, which have different costs to have equipped. And the effects of these can range from increasing your HP and FP even more, allowing you to jump on spiked enemies. And it's really this badge system, and something that I'll explain in a second, that is able to keep the combat very varied, and it gives the player enough flexibility in customization to keep the gameplay engaging throughout. One badge I want to pinpoint for those who may be thinking about jumping into Paper Mario 64 is the Quick Change badge, which you can't get until a few chapters in, but I would highly recommend going to get it as soon as you finish the chapter that you get the spin jump ability in, which is what they call the ground pound in this game for some reason. I would call spin jumping a different thing that you can do in this game. What you do once you have what the game calls the spin jump, which is the ground pound, you go into Merlin's tent in Toad Town and do the spin jump, I think 3 times, I want to say, and the quick change badge will fall from the ceiling and you can pick that up. It does cost a decent amount of badge points to equip, but it's well worth it. And what this quick change badge does is allows you to swap your partners out without that swap taking up your action. So you're able to swap your partner and take an action in the same turn, which honestly I think should be how a Paper Mario RPG should be structured in the first place, and then you can balance things around that. It's a must-have. It makes combat a lot more enjoyable. And so partners are your various party members that you encounter throughout the game. The partners in the original Paper Mario are pretty vanilla for the most part. You've got your Goomba, he wears a little hat, that's cute. You have a Koopa Troopa who has a bandana around his neck, that's cute, etc. and so on. I want to say there's 8 partners total in PM64, each of which can have their various roles in combat and can do a number of actions that Mario is not capable of. So you really do, in some instances, need to lean on them, sometimes even more than you would lean on Mario's skill set. Although Mario's skill set is flexible through the badge system, but with the partners, you need to find these upgrade blocks throughout the Mushroom Kingdom that allows you to power up a singular partner. You're able to do this twice eventually, and there are just enough power-up blocks to max everyone out. So you don't need to worry worry about not being able to max everyone. I maxed everyone throughout my playthrough and didn't really have much of an issue finding most of these. But yeah, these power-up blocks not only increase the damage that your partners deal, but also give them new abilities. Though in this game in particular, I didn't find myself using all of the partners equally. I generally stuck to the same few partners over and over and over again. And so the way partners function in battle is that they don't have a health pool, but if they get hit, they'll just have to sit out for a few turns before getting back up. And now to move on to the traversal and exploration side of things, which I think remained pretty rewarding from beginning to end, primarily because most of what you were finding were these upgrade blocks, which are pretty significant upgrades to your arsenal, considering how valuable partners are in combat. But they're also valuable in traversal, where Paracarry can carry you across medium-sized gaps, Sushi allows you to get in the water at designated spots, and there's a number of other overworld abilities that these guys have. But in addition to that, in Paper Mario 64 exclusively, you have the spin move, which you use by pressing the L button, or I guess the ZL button apparently on Wii U and Switch. And so by pressing this button, Mario does a spin, which allows him to move a lot faster. You might notice that if you just do the spin without inputting anything, Mario slows down eventually to a stop for a quick second, then you can do it again. But if you jump mid-spin, you're able to keep moving. And so traversal in this game tends to feel pretty engaging in that you're trying to time your jump as close to the end of the spin animation as possible before Mario starts to lose momentum. And if you couple this with the quick spin badge, or whatever it's called later on, you can zip through these areas at lightning speed. It's a really nice accommodation to getting around. And I'll say that the runtime for Paper Mario 64 took me just under 20 hours. I think it was closer to maybe 18 or 19. This included, as I said before, maxing out all of my partners and delivering any letters that I came across, which you can do once Paracarry joins your party. I think there is some other side stuff that you can do as well, which I didn't end up participating in, but generally I feel like I did pretty much all I wanted to do within that 20-hour threshold, which was good. It didn't feel like the game was overstaying its welcome at all. And just the steady acquisition of new partners, empowering them up, and then leveling Mario up and getting more powerful boots or more powerful hammer throughout the story was able to keep things feeling like they were progressing in a way that didn't feel superfluous. Overall, I ended up really enjoying Paper Mario 64 more than I expected, and I actually highly recommend it if you're looking for something to tide you over until and even segue into the Thousand Year Door remake when that releases in 2024. And speaking of, my initial plan was to wait for the remake of the Thousand Year Door to come out, but I wanted to at least jump into the original for a bit to get a feel for it, so that way when I did jump into the remake, I would have something to compare it to. But of course, I couldn't just stop at an hour or two. I ended up playing for way longer than I intended, to the point where I ultimately decided to play through the Thousand Year Door all the way. I'm going to try to focus primarily on the differences between these two games when talking about the Thousand Year Door, because these games ultimately are very similar and I think kind of serve well as a duology of sorts. You don't necessarily need to play Paper Mario 64, but I would recommend playing it beforehand if you can, just to have some familiarity with it. So now when it comes to the Thousand Year Door setting, it is still technically set in the Mushroom Kingdom, but it feels very uncharacteristic of your typical Mario game. But I say that as a compliment. The hub this time around is Rogueport, which is this kind of rundown, crime-ridden location. And while saying that out loud makes it sound like, oh, that wouldn't work well in the context of Mario, but it does, and it works actually really well. The characters that you interact with in the Thousand Year Door make Rogueport feel believable in the Mario universe. Mario gets mugged, he's able to beat up a bouncer to avoid paying a fee, he becomes the champion of a somewhat shady fighting ring, has his identity stolen, etc. and so on. The locales and chapters and events of this game are way more outlandish than that of Paper Mario 64, but in a way that I was still able to buy it, despite the very non-Mario feel to a lot of locations in particular. Dialogue remains well written through this game as well, but it is noticeably wordier than its predecessor, which did on some occasions become annoying. Sometimes it's wordy for the sake of humor partner, and that did land in certain instances. There were some times, maybe within the first half, where I was like, okay, can we shut up and move it along a little bit? Combat-wise, encounters flow just as well as the first game, with even more dynamic elements played into it, like the various stage hazards and some other improvements on the back end, like your partners having actual health pools, and you can actually swap position with your partner, whereas I think in Paper Mario 64, they always stayed behind you, but you could choose to have them act first, whereas in the Thousand Year Door, if you have them act first, they'll swap to the front, which I think in most cases made them more susceptible to taking damage, but not always. Partners also felt way more fleshed out and unique as characters, at least compared to Paper Mario 64. Maybe not so much compared to a lot of other RPGs out there. There is a lot of fun and unique dialogue depending on who your active partner is during various events of the game. Although it was something where if I ran into a particular character spontaneously, I would be thinking to myself, damn it, I wish that I had this partner active so that I could hear what they have to say, because they have some kind of relation to these characters. Because more often than not, I had the Yoshi as my partner for traversal reasons. It is kind of a shame that you do have to specifically have an individual partner out to hear their reaction. I know that's something that old school JRPG fans view as an element of replayability, so to speak, where it's like, oh, okay, in my next playthrough, I'm going to have these characters in my party so I can see how they react. But I feel like that's kind of a shallow incentive for replayability. In theory, I would like to be able to see everyone's reaction, but I know that in practice, that just ends up with everyone saying a one-liner, and that doesn't feel particularly natural in most cases. But more so, if you're interacting with certain characters, I think it would be nice if relevant characters popped up and made some kind of comment on it. I know that's somewhat impractical, it's just a thought that I had. The level cap was also increased dramatically, as far as I understand, but I didn't get anywhere close to it. I didn't mention what level I was in 64. I think I beat it at level 24, I want to say, with maxed out badge points and my health and FP being at like the 35 to 40 range or something along those lines. And then in the Thousand Year Door, I beat the game at level 27, which funny enough is the level cap for PM64. And so I ended Thousand Year Door with 40 HP, 35 FP, and 45 BP. I find the economy of the Thousand Year Door to be a lot more dynamic, where you can sell excess badges, and partially by virtue of that, but kind of just in general, coins were extremely abundant. I was never really left wanting for purchasing a badge or item or like whatever. And then even at a certain point, I wasn't really buying much anyway, so it's like Mario just had this fat wad of coins that was just sitting there for most of the game's runtime. The final boss was a notable difficulty spike, and unfortunately was paired with very long segments of dialogue and cutscenes that made repeat attempts feel very annoying. Way more annoying than they needed to be, and just reminded me of how a lot of RPGs from that era, and even earlier, of course, didn't allow you to skip those kinds of things, which like on a first viewing, yeah, you want to pay attention to that stuff. If I'm going to jump in for a second or third attempt right away, I got to slog through all of this dialogue and these unskippable cutscenes for however many attempts it might take you, which might just be further incentive to go back and fill up your inventory more or grind a little bit or whatever it might be. But it seemed like it would be even more tedious to just try to go all the way back to Rogueport and then all the way back to where the final boss was later. So I just kind of brute forced my way through. I do think that if I was at a higher level and or showed up with a fully stocked inventory, which I didn't quite have, and so I was working with a fairly limited pool of items. And also the final boss has a pretty sizable health pool, attacks that can be tricky to time, and also has the possibility to status you in various ways. Ultimately, part of my success with that third attempt was the RNG on the status effects not fucking me over, because they very much did on my first and second attempts. I don't have a problem with the final boss being difficult, it's just it was such a spike from anything else the game had thrown at me to that point, where I really wish the game had a steadier progression of difficulty instead of just having this sharp increase at the very, very end. And like, yeah, you can put limitations on yourself for most of the game's runtime to make things somewhat challenging, I guess. While I tend to find difficulty modes that simply increase enemy health pools and increase the damage they deal, I feel like that might weirdly be enough, at least when it comes to boss fights. I really don't need enemy encounters to go on longer than they need to. As I was praising earlier when it came to the health pools in general being pretty low in both of these games, even though Paper Mario 64 wasn't challenging by any means, I noticed that Thousand Year Door felt maybe even easier in most cases, but I think that's also just due to the flexibility you have and the amount of tools at your disposal in Thousand Year Door compared to 64. But then it's like, why wouldn't you build the boss fights to try to accommodate the fact that the player has much more powerful tools at their disposal? Ultimately, it's a fairly small thing. I'm not going into a Mario themed game for like an extreme challenge or anything, because I know that these games are primarily aimed at kids, but at the same time, it would be nice to have some kind of hard mode, even if it was locked behind a new game plus of sorts. I don't know, just a thought. Oh, and before I forget to mention, the quick change badge in Thousand Year Door is purchasable with star shards that you find around the world. world. This was something you could also find in 64, but there wasn't really much of note that was purchasable with them in 64, whereas in Thousand Year Door, the quick change badge is purchasable, and so I would recommend saving your star shards for that and purchasing that as soon as possible. It costs 7 badge points, and so you're going to need to invest at least 2 level ups into your badge points to get your BP high enough to equip that, and even higher if you want to equip other stuff on top of that, of course. But I will say, because the level cap is so high in the Thousand Year Door, you could limit yourself to only increasing your BP, and so not giving yourself more health or more flower points to do more powerful techniques to try to make the game harder. To me, that sounds like it would feel very artificial, though, in a way that doesn't sound fun, right? Like, what is the Thousand Year Door without using a lot of those extra techniques? It is nice that that element is there to make those kinds of challenges possible, but I don't know that that is necessarily the right answer. I think that it would need to be something that's built into the game more explicitly, I think, for it to make sense in my mind. I found that exploration was generally pretty rewarding, although, as I was saying, it's easy to have an overabundance of coins throughout your playthrough, so some of the stuff you were finding didn't feel as valuable as in the original Paper Mario. Then again, you do have to pay to heal yourself in this game, whereas it was free in the first game, so it's like a small thing that feels somewhat significant early on, but way less so as you go. The way that you upgrade your partners this time is by finding shine sprites, kind of similar to how you found the power-up blocks, except you need 3 shine sprites to upgrade your partners this time around. You can also do it twice, although you have to unlock the ability to do the second upgrade. And I found all the shine sprites and maxed my party out this time around as well. That was something that was really enjoyable. And because there were more shine sprites than power-up blocks, you know, by virtue of there needing to be 3 times as many, essentially, I found them frequently enough to where I was able to upgrade my partners pretty regularly, but not so frequently that they didn't still feel valuable. Except maybe by the very end when I was upgrading the party members I didn't use as much. In Thousand Year Door, there are 6 mandatory party members and 1 optional party member, but most of the party members got play in combat. There were still some that I favored over others, but I found that even just that slight decrease in party size made the partners feel a little bit more valuable individually. And they also felt a lot more distinct characterization-wise and design-wise and all that. Despite exploration feeling pretty rewarding in this game, I did find the backtracking to be pretty egregious, especially so if you decide to do all the side quests, which I was doing up until around chapter 6 or 7, at which point I kind of got sick of it. With the side quests in particular, you can only accept one at a time, despite many of them taking you to very similar locations, which makes for a lot more back and forth than should be necessary. And due to this, and also the rewards for a lot of the quests just being coins, which don't feel like they have much value because of the abundance of them, I recommend looking up the rewards for these side quests and only doing the ones that you want the rewards for. Unless you specifically are trying to do all of them, in which case, good luck. It's very tedious. I wouldn't recommend it. As someone who I think has a fairly high tolerance for backtracking, and in this game's case, I did find the backtracking to be pretty grating at times, but the world of this game was so comforting that it never really got to the point of feeling actively frustrating to me. Aside from the side quests, obviously, that shit was kind of ass. Main quest-wise, there was still a fair amount of backtracking, and if I had skipped a lot of the side quests that I opted to do, I don't think it would have felt as bad. Although I definitely can see where some players would come away from this game, especially after playing 64, and feeling like it's a big downside. Which, I mean, it's definitely not an upside, but it also doesn't ruin the game for me. So the runtime, according to my save file, was almost exactly 30 hours. Though with those few final boss attempts, it probably would have crossed that 30-hour mark by a little bit. And while the backtracking and occasional wordiness of the dialogue did feel like it padded the game time a bit, I still wouldn't say that the game overstayed its welcome, especially again considering I could have just done without doing a lot of the side quests. And one big plus for the Thousand Year Door that I haven't really delved much into is that there's post-game content, which actually takes place after the final boss, which is contrary to what I'm used to. So that's really cool. I didn't really jump into the post-game of the Thousand Year Door enough to say how much that matters, but I think the concept is really nice. I always wanted that when I was a kid, specifically with Battle Network and Zelda. It would be really cool if there was a version of the worlds in those games where the final boss was defeated and maybe there's more to do after the fact, but really generally once those final bosses are defeated in those stories, is there really much more to tell without just getting into the plot of a new game? And so ultimately, I came away preferring the Thousand Year Door thanks to its more unique setting and fleshed out mechanics. That's not to say the game is without its flaws, particularly the backtracking and extreme ease of difficulty. The original Paper Mario also had its moments where those same flaws were apparent, but not quite as often as its successor. But while I do think that I prefer the Thousand Year Door overall, I'm already looking back at both of these games pretty fondly, though I am curious what changes, if any, are being made to the Thousand Year Door remake aside from presentation. Because Nintendo remakes tend to be pretty one-to-one. Yeah, there are things that are added, and that stuff is appreciated, but I find that that type of remake, to me at least, feels a little bit like what's the point when it's so similar to the original? Aside from accessibility, of course. Not everyone has a GameCube, not everyone is willing to emulate, I know that. But as someone who just emulated the original Thousand Year Door, I'm probably not going to pick up the remake day one. Depending on what changes are made aside from presentation, I could see that being the version I eventually purchase and play when I want to play the Thousand Year Door. But I don't know, something about most Nintendo remakes tends to feel just a little too safe for my tastes, especially for full $60 releases. But that kind of thing is in the wallet of the beholder, so I don't judge anyone for buying any particular game full price. Just like I wouldn't expect people to necessarily agree with what games I prioritize buying at full price versus waiting for a sale. That's a whole nother conversation. As far as my interest in the following Paper Mario games, I would say that there pretty much is none. And it's not solely because they're not turn-based JRPGs. I always find it interesting when people dismiss the later Paper Mario games because of that specifically, whereas to me it just seems like the execution for the later Paper Mario games is just lacking for what they are trying to be it turn-based RPG or not, which I know it's not in this particular case, but in my limited experience with Super Paper Mario, for instance, that game being more of a platforming RPG, I didn't find the platforming to feel as tight as I would like, especially for a series that has a long lineage in platformers, albeit I'm sure Super Paper Mario was developed by a completely different team than those who handle the actual platformers, but you would think that a Mario platforming RPG, regardless of what team makes it, would feel at least remotely as good as your typical Mario platformer. And then Sticker Star and on, I just genuinely don't have any interest. Even as far as, are these games as bad as people say? Like, I don't really care, but I am very glad that I played these first two. And I do think that these first two games do kind of stand alone as a duology. But anyhow, let me know what you guys think about Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door specifically. I guess if you want to lament the trajectory of the series since then, you can, but like, I know it's pretty clear, even aside from the later games not being turn-based RPGs, it's just the execution of whatever they're trying to be just isn't there seemingly. So it is what it is. I know some people are hopeful that the Thousand Year Door remake will reinvigorate Nintendo's interest in greenlighting a new Paper Mario RPG with similar structure and combat to these first two games, but I wouldn't buy the remake solely for that purpose. I'm just too familiar with Nintendo's ignorance to believe that the remake selling well, which I'm sure it will regardless, would change their mind significantly on stuff like that, but maybe I'm wrong. Either way, I do want to thank my channel members and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and here's to a prosperous 2024.